Hi, everyone. Once again, this is Sarah Ostman from the American Library Association's Public Programs Office. We at ALA are very excited to be partnering with the ALA Center for Civic Life and the David Mathews Center for Civic Life to offer today's webinar on naming and framing, along with part 2 of the webinar series to be held on December 3rd. A quick note before we get started, if you have any technical problems during today's webinar, please send a private message to Colleen Barbas. There are instructions on how to do that in the chat box, which is located at the lower right corner of your screen. Now I'm going to turn it over to Nancy Cronick of ALA's Center for Civic Life to begin today's presentation. Nancy?
Thank you, Sarah, and thanks to all of you for joining us today, and those of you who are listening to us on the archive version of the webinar, which should be available quite soon. I'm Nancy Cronick. I'm the founder and convener of the American Library Association Center for Civic Life. This webinar is the first in a series we are sponsoring about naming and framing public issues. Through naming and framing, we capture the shared concerns of citizens, and we define a problem in public terms, terms that are meaningful to citizens. And we'll learn a lot more about what that means as we go through the webinar. This is the 6th webinar that we've offered over the past few years, all of which have been produced by the ALA Public Programs Office. We're pleased to have their involvement with these efforts. All the previous ones are archived, and this one will be too. If you want to go back and learn more about other topics, particularly how to moderate forums that we've done in the past. Let me move on now to give you an overview of today's webinar. Today's webinar is entitled Beyond Deadlock, a Better Way to Talk About Difficult Issues, and it's intended to inform participants about better ways to help people work together to talk about public issues and make choices, and uncover the deeper concerns of our communities by listening to people reveal what really matters to them. Our second webinar in this series, Tools for Naming and Framing Public Issues, is scheduled for December 3rd. You can register for that webinar now or anytime before that date. That session will focus on applying tools to develop issue maps that help people weigh options for moving forward together. So let me tell you a little bit about our sponsors. The ALA Center for Civic Life promotes community engagement and fosters public deliberation through libraries. We are delighted that we are joined today by the David Mathews Center for Public Life in Montevallo, Alabama, in presenting this series of webinars to you. The David Mathews Center fosters infrastructure, habits, and capacities for more effective civic engagement and innovative decision-making. They do amazing work facilitating public dialogue. They've worked with the Birmingham, Alabama Public Library and Alabama Public Broadcasting on various initiatives, some of which we'll hear more about during this series of webinars. So you've probably already figured out how to use the chat box, but just in case you haven't, here's a few tips. So if you want to interact with us during the webinar, that you can type into chat. Only our speakers are going to have access to the microphone. You can interact with us anytime by typing into the chat box, and we'll either respond right after you type it in, or we'll wait till the end, depending on the circumstances. In the meantime, if you haven't already done so, I hope you will say hello to us in the chat box, get used to it, but also tell us your name and where you're located. I see a lot of people have already done that. So here's an overview of our discussion today. Different speakers will lead each section. We'll introduce them at each stage, but you can also learn more about them by reviewing the biographical information that is available for download from this webinar, which you might have already gotten, or we might have sent it to you as well. It's also available on our ALA Connect site, where there's lots of related information, including a list of links and additional resources, which we also gave you for downloading today. And we're going to start the webinar by hearing from our colleagues at the David Mathews Center, Chris McCauley, Kristen Murphin, and Robert Turner, who will help you think about your community, naming and framing opportunities, and problem types. Then we'll hear from several members of the ALA Center for Civic Life Advisory Committee, Carolyn Kaywood, Patty Janine, and Nancy Cronick. That's me again. Who we're going to focus on the importance of diverse perspectives, public deliberation, and public space. So now let me turn over the mic to Chris McCauley, who's director of the David Mathews Center for Civic Life.
Thank you, Nancy. The David Mathews Center for Civic Life is a nonpartisan, education-focused nonprofit that connects, educates, and strengthens Alabama's communities by helping their citizens address shared issues and problems. Today, I plan to start our webinar on naming and framing difficult public issues with a real example. Specifically, I'm going to explore a signature program of the David Mathews Center entitled Alabama Issues Forums. Let's start by exploring the beginning stages of the statewide project, which will help illustrate the practices of naming, framing, and public deliberation. Throughout 2010-2011, the Mathews Center convened, moderated, and recorded Alabama Issues Forums across the state on the dropout situation. At the forums, citizens considered multiple approaches to addressing the dropout situation and made decisions about next steps. Many young participants at the dropout forums also shared concerns about the bullying issue. In some cases, students said that bullying behavior made them avoid school. During the same period of time, awareness around the bullying issue was being raised through articles, documentaries, websites, and emerging nonprofits. The Mathews Center staff, interns, and collaborators began to listen closely to citizens across the state as they shared concerns around the bullying issue. In many cases, folks started to say, this is a problem and we need to do something about it. And to an extent, a sense of urgency began to emerge. The Center's mission is focused on effectively engaging the public on difficult, wicked issues. We'll talk more about what we mean by wicked issues a little later in the webinar. In order to do that work, we often name and frame issues in public terms and craft frameworks and issue books that help guide deliberative discussions. Rather than working with a small group of experts to name and frame issues, though, we work with citizens. When naming an issue, it's important to use public terms rather than expert terms. For instance, when we started to hear people talk about bullying, they would share their concerns by saying, my kids are suffering, or students would say, I don't want to go to school because I'm being bullied. While naming the issue and engaging in this exercise with many folks around the state, we also realized that people were asking the question, what is bullying and what can we do about it? We'll discuss that question more in just a moment. After working to name bullying, we asked people to help frame multiple approaches to addressing the issue. We did this by asking people to share their concerns around bullying, and when people shared their concerns around the issue, we began to highlight what they hold valuable and worked to identify multiple approaches to addressing the problem. Approaches that help us answer the question, what are we going to do about it? As we'll discuss later in the webinar, wicked problems, such as bullying, do not often have a single solution. So we have to work to identify multiple approaches that need to be considered as we start to make hard choices. Through several naming and framing workshops, we identified 3 unique approaches to addressing the bullying issue. The approaches are included in a framework entitled Bullying, What is it? How do we prevent it? Each approach works to uniquely address the question posed in the title and in turn highlights a variety of possible actions as well as costs and consequences to consider. Approach 1 focuses on getting tough on bullying and really emphasizes tougher consequences, zero tolerance policies, and so on. Approach 2 focuses on equipping students to address the issue and focuses a good bit of time on raising awareness and getting students to think through how they respond to bullying. And lastly, or the third approach, focuses on engaging the community and parents in bullying solutions. By working with Alabama citizens to name and frame the issue, the public could see themselves in the framework. It's not abstract, it's not academic, it's a catalyst for public work. Now, let's talk about the public work that resulted. The Center used the framework to guide forums throughout Alabama Issues Forums 2012-2013, which is a year-long project cycle. At each forum, participants learned about bullying, examined the issue, talked through multiple approaches, weighed costs and consequences, made decisions, and, in some cases, took action. In other words, people engaged in real public deliberation and real public work. Altogether, we moderated and recorded 156 forums in 44 counties with close to 4,500 people. You can access both the issue guide that we used as well as the comprehensive report on our website at mathewscenter.org/resources. So, what did the forums lead to? Well, in a few cities, real decisions were made and action followed. Birmingham librarians printed unique posters to raise public awareness. Citizens in Selma coordinated a day-long summit designed to educate students and parents on the issue. And students and citizens in Troy continued engaging citizens in public discussions for an extended period of time and later scheduled a 5K race to raise awareness. We're still learning together, and we're always interested to hear from community partners about the public work that they are doing. Many of these stories and themes are highlighted in the comprehensive report I referenced a moment ago, which is designed to communicate real public judgment. In other words, informed decision-making. This is not a scientific process, though, and to be honest, there's no single strategy for doing this work. That being said, we think that the story of our statewide bullying forum series helps to highlight several democratic practices that helped Alabamians make better decisions together. Now, I'd like to introduce Mathews Center Program Director Kristen Foster, who will explore those practices in greater detail.
Good afternoon. I'm Kristen Foster, and I serve as Program Director for the David Mathews Center for Civic Life. Chris just described how the bullying issue was named and framed for deliberation, and how the resulting issue guide, entitled Bullying, What Is It? How Do We Prevent It?, was used to engage citizens across Alabama in meaningful deliberation and thoughtful decision-making on a challenging public issue. Let's now talk through what naming and framing issues for deliberation looks like and the part it can play in helping the public move from raw public opinion on an issue or public problem to reasoned, informed public judgment. Daniel Yankelovich, public opinion analyst and co-founder of Public Agenda, captured how the public works through public problems and issues based on his observations during decades of analyzing the public's response to those issues. The continuum on your slide is an outline of his description of the somewhat messy progression the public takes from raw public opinion to reasoned, informed public judgment. Public opinion is the raw opinions and public reactions to an issue that is just beginning to rise to the public's consciousness. As news articles, documentaries, opinion pieces, and personal stories around an issue begin to emerge, awareness is raised, and people express concern and form opinions based on how the issue is affecting them. We saw this with the bullying issue when parents told stories about their children, their schools, and their neighborhoods, rather than speaking abstractly about other people's children, schools, and neighborhoods. This is when naming occurs, as people begin to express concern with an issue and define it in terms that are meaningful to them. As people begin expressing emotion around what is important to them, a sense of urgency develops. People begin to say something should be done. As people connect their concerns to what they think should be done, they frame approaches and identify possible solutions for addressing the issue, and possible choices emerge. At this point, the public often expresses the desire to choose all options before they have a chance to deliberate. For example, citizens may express that they want schools to institute harsher consequences for bullying, while also rehabilitating those who engage in bullying behavior. While choosing all options is desirable, it is next to impossible for communities with limited time and resources. So citizens must deliberate together, work through potential costs and possible consequences, and weigh trade-offs. Citizens must think through what they as individuals and as a community are willing and unwilling to do to address an issue. For example, like Chris spoke about earlier, citizens in Selma came together. They found common ground around equipping and preparing students and parents to better address bullying. So they made decisions together to organize a community summit to do just that, and over 200 citizens participated in that informative event. After deliberating together, citizens formulate a thoughtful response based on reason rather than emotion, and they make decisions together. The public can then make a reasonable stand for the greater good and take ownership of the issue. Citizens begin to talk about what we can do together, rather than just identifying what the nebulous they can do. Citizens arrive at reasoned, informed public judgment and can speak with a more unified voice after having deeply examined an issue, weighed trade-offs, and identified areas of common ground. Just like Chris spoke about earlier, how we communicated that public judgment through a comprehensive report on the Bullying Forum series that went out to not only policymakers, but also concerned citizens and forum participants and conveners as well. So how do we frame public issues in a way that prompts citizens to engage in the meaningful, genuine deliberation we have described? We do this by naming and framing for deliberation. So what is naming? Naming issues for deliberation captures the shared concerns of citizens. When naming issues for deliberation, it is important to listen deeply to understand what citizens hold valuable, what they care deeply about. Naming issues for deliberation defines a problem in public terms, terms that are meaningful to citizens. This goes beyond simply using accessible language to closely listening to how the public talks about a problem and using the terms they use to describe the problem. So what are the terms citizens are using, and how do they differ from terms that experts or policymakers might use? And how do those terms reflect what citizens hold valuable and really care about? For example, with the bullying issue, a bullying expert might talk about bullying in terms of a power imbalance and a repetition of a pattern of behavior over time, while concerned citizens might speak about how kids are suffering, and young people might express their concern around bullying by saying that they don't want to go to school. To identify how the public names an issue, ask questions like, what concerns you personally about this issue? When you think about this issue, what worries or bothers you? And what makes this issue real for you? Regardless of the form it takes, the key question in naming is what concerns you. After naming an issue in public terms by gathering the public's concerns, how do you go about framing the issue for deliberation? If the key question to understanding how the public names a problem is what concerns you, then the key question for framing is what should be done to address this issue. Framing issues for deliberation uncovers approaches or options for acting on a problem. Framing highlights potential solutions to the issue, as well as inherent tensions, trade-offs, and potential costs and consequences. Framing for deliberation goes beyond the often polarizing two-approach frameworks used in partisan debates to identify the multiple solutions that often exist to address complex issues facing citizens. Each approach is informed by something the public commonly holds valuable, like freedom, justice, equality, or security. Each approach contains possible solutions as well as potential costs to consider. So how do we frame for deliberation? We cluster the concerns expressed by citizens during the naming process around things that are commonly held valuable, such as equality or security. Identify possible solutions that fit within that approach, as well as corresponding consequences to consider. The resulting 3 to 4 approaches are rarely exhaustive, but they tap into what the public holds valuable and keep deliberation focused on making decisions and taking action. The approaches get participants thinking through what they are and are not willing to do to address an issue, and move the group beyond simply sharing concerns or bemoaning an issue to weighing choices, working through trade-offs, and making decisions about what should be done. As we know, there are many ways to name and frame issues. Political parties and interest groups often frame issues for partisan purposes. So why naming and framing for deliberation? Well, it reflects how the public sees a problem. Citizens are more likely to take ownership of an issue if their concerns are captured in the framing. It uses language that prompts the public to work through a problem rather than just talk about it. The approaches are framed in a way that asks the public to think deeply about an issue and weigh costs and trade-offs. It brings the public together to own and work through a problem, and it helps citizens identify areas of common ground for taking action. It also asks citizens to work through tensions within and among approaches, weigh trade-offs, and make choices. It also views citizens as actors rather than passive recipients. Public deliberation sees citizens as active participants in democracy, particularly in decision-making, rather than passive consumers. The end goal of naming and framing for deliberation is citizens committing to act together in their communities. We have seen the benefits of naming and framing issues for deliberation so that citizens are engaged in examining the issue, weighing trade-offs, identifying common ground, and making decisions on complex public issues. However, not all public problems are suitable for naming and framing for deliberation. Some are technical problems that require straightforward technical solutions, while others are systemic, quote-unquote, wicked problems that do not have clear solutions. In fact, there may even be disagreements. My colleague, Robert Turner, will now explore with you the types of problems most suitable for naming and framing for deliberation.
Thanks, Kristen. Now I will discuss that we encounter on a regular basis in our community. How we define a problem is extremely important. President and CEO of the Kettering Foundation, Dr. David Mathews, in his work For Communities to Work, says, who defines a problem and the name it is given determine the number of people who will be available to solve it and the kind of response that will emerge. This quote summarizes the importance of having sound-minded and diverse people having a role in defining a problem. We have discovered that there are two ways problems are defined or categorized: tame or wicked. Tame problems have a clear scientific solution. The outcome is very clear. Some examples of a tame problem are a chemist determining the structure of a compound. The mixtures of these experiments are clear and can be judged. The Pythagorean theorem: a squared plus b squared equals c squared. This is a mathematical geometric equation that while the variables are unknown, the equation is clear and all one needs to do is plug in the variables by following standard geometric rules. A chess player attempting to achieve checkmate in 5 moves is another example of a tame problem. These problems need not undergo a deliberative forum in order to broach action, because they are clear and empirical. And whether or not the problem has been solved, the mission is nonetheless very evident. While these problems are by no means easy, their solutions are known and in most cases tangible. Anytime solutions are known and widely held, our experience has taught us those problems do not need a deliberative forum to discuss their varying approaches. Some examples of tame problems in the community are a pothole in the street, a broken glass in a neighborhood building. These problems have clear, definable solutions. Fix the pothole and replace the broken glass. The type of problem which best fits the medium of public exchange known as deliberation is called wicked problems. Wicked problems are difficult to define. They have no clear solution. They are tricky and aggressive, and their outcomes are uncertain. The term wicked does not denote any moral conceptions of good and bad. It simply defines the complexity of the issue as being malignant, tricky, or aggressive. Some examples of wicked problems are bullying, the dropout rate, prison overcrowding, and nearly all public policy issues. Each of these stated problems have issue guides produced by the David Mathews Center, which explain the varying approaches citizens can take in tackling these complex issues. Moreover, Hurst, Riddle, and Melvin Weber, in their work, quote, Dilemmas in General Theory of Planning, state that it is extremely harmful to treat wicked problems as though they are tame problems. To do so minimizes the true difficulty which is present in navigating through the murky aspects of wicked problems. You cannot use technical, tame solutions on a wicked problem. For instance, wicked problems have no definitive formulation. And because of the nature of wicked problems, they have no stopping point, unlike a tame problem when one makes the proverbial checkmate. And lastly, every wicked problem is unique, while also be a symptom of another problem. Poll questions for your input. Can you think of any specific example of problems in your community? If so, would you be so willing to share with the group by typing into the chat box to your right? You can do so at this time. In conclusion, the approach described is not prescriptive. It is definitely not normative. It is not exhaustive. It's not a complete, comprehensive review of every problem. It emphasizes, though, democratic practices. It emphasizes a shared learning, which is what we're trying to do today. It encourages citizens to address wicked problems in creative ways. And lastly, it focuses on building relationships, making decisions, and strengthening our communities. Now we will have Carolyn Kaywood, who was a branch manager for the Virginia Library when the library was a key player in naming and framing redevelopment.
Hi. I want to assure you that yes, libraries and librarians can do this work. The Virginia Beach Public Library was deeply involved in the research, organizing of information, planning, and facilitating meetings on the topic of redevelopment. As I talk about community, please think of the people you serve or might serve. It could be a faculty and students, a city or county, employees and management, whatever kind of community makes sense in your context. Think about them that way. As in most localities, the professional planners in Virginia Beach were expert in the technical aspects of development and redevelopment. But real communities are not built by technical choices alone. They're also about what the residents value. City officials and eager developers wanted to change obsolete land uses, but a core of activists, deeply worried about the loss of property rights, had already defeated an attempt to put a redevelopment authority in place. In fact, redevelopment was an inflammatory word capable of halting productive discourse. While redevelopment ideas were being professionally generated, the pretty pictures weren't generating any progress. So, the city manager, at great political risk, approved a multi-step approach that began by inviting all in the community to work together to unpack the problem. And this is a picture of them working on it. Of course, lack of trust and communication emerged early and often. But after voices and concerns were gathered from across the entire community, the real barrier to progress was not technical. The underlying issue discovered with the process was about inclusion in defining the future of how their city would look and work. The named issue was about the use of political power. That is, who gets to decide. Would it be just the developers, only the city planners, or would the citizens have a voice? That renamed issue and those choices gave us a framework for the community deliberations that followed. The lesson we learned was that getting stuck, an inability to move forward to identify a solution, is often about conflicting values. There's no technical fix to these value-based wicked problems. The competing values create a problem that hasn't yet been named by those stuck in conflict. So around and around the combatants go. Each one presumes to know what the problem is, and frequently they come nowhere close to the real issue, much less to any solution. But there is a better way. Involve all the stakeholders to discover and give the issue a name. Then the choices, that is the options, can become a new frame that changes the conversation by diffusing polarized views. Then the way is open to finding mutually valued, community-discovered progress. When the David Mathews Center in Alabama got people talking about school dropouts, they uncovered another concern, bullying. When Virginia Beach citizens talked together about land use and property rights, they discovered a deeper concern about having a voice in those decisions. Talking with and listening to the people in your community may uncover concerns you didn't imagine, or reveal which aspects of an issue really matter to people. Issue framing at its best is a journey that citizens take together to uncover the underlying issues, the underlying barriers to community progress. This journey prepares us for a meaningful deliberation where citizens gather to confront and make choices for their futures. Now, Patty Janine of the National Issues Forum will explain how a named and framed issue can be used to structure deliberation programs.
Thanks, Carolyn. Hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be with you today. I'm Patty Janine, and I work with the National Issues Forums and with various public engagement projects around the country. I just want to spend a couple moments highlighting some of the points that presenters have already made and pointing out things about the goals of this work and especially the central role that the kind of talk we call deliberation plays in the process, and then the eventual use of the issue framework. So if you do this work of issue framing, and I hope you might consider giving it a try, you'll find it really is hard work, and it's easy to get lost in the process, the terms, the definitions, the work itself. So I think it helps everybody if you try to check back once in a while and keep a few ideas and goals clear about what it is you're trying to create and how people are intended to be able to use it when you're done. So above all, you'll be creating a tool, the issue framework, for people to use to work on a public problem. The final product, or this tool, can take a lot of forms. On the left there, you see the cover image of another version of the bullying issue guide. And as a couple people already mentioned, Daniel Yankelovich has written a lot about public issues and how the public works on an issue and what the public can use to really help work on public problems. So one of the things that he points out is that the experts and the public often see issues and parts of the issues in very different ways, and that sometimes there's a very big, even a huge gap to bridge. And he contends that one of the things that an issue framework can do very well is to help bridge this gap. He also points out that it takes some research to understand and learn about the gap between expert and public perceptions. And this research aspect of issue framing is often the most neglected part of doing the work. There are, as others have pointed out, many ways to frame an issue, and many different parts of the public are framing issues for different purposes. There's a lot of experimentation going on with issue framing for the purpose of deliberation. So I hope you might get involved in this experimentation and this really important work and share what you learn from it so that we can all move together to make this kind of work more effective. So the quick answer to the question, what is a framework for deliberation? For one thing, as the word framework implies, it is a basic structure. So it's intended to be a tool, a particular kind of tool that people can use to work on a public problem. And as others have pointed out, it needs to include a number of different parts to it, including several different approaches to the problem, some details about what those approaches might be, information, trade-offs in following any particular approach, and consequences. And it's all intended to help people make choices about what to do. Just as the photographer who took the picture you see on the left of your screen there, whether consciously or not, had to do some framing of that scene. Issue frameworks also have to determine things like focus, boundaries, the range of what will and will not be included in the framework, and sometimes what's not included can be just as important as what is included. The issue framework as a tool is meant to help push people toward a kind of talk that we call deliberation, or to deliberate. The word itself actually means to very carefully weigh different aspects of the approach, to weigh facts and arguments, and it's all aimed toward helping people eventually make a choice or a decision about what they want to do. So keep in mind the end, which is that people will have a tool that can help them work on problems together in a productive way. And here's a picture of a group who's using an issue framework to talk about a public problem. People will be, and often are, extremely appreciative of having some help with doing this kind of work. It gives them a fresh way to approach a problem in a productive way. And people will be very, very grateful that the work that you do to help produce this kind of tool that can really help them work in a much better way together. So it's really important work, and I think you need to keep that in mind as you embark on this. So thank you for your attention, and now to close out the webinar and to lead us in some question and answer. Again, here's Nancy Kronick of the American Library Association Center for Civic Life.
Thanks, Patty. I want to finish up today's webinar by discussing the importance of public space to this dialogue process. So let me begin by talking about the decline of public space in our society. Far too many people are fleeing the public square, which is filled with venomous discourse, more focused on blame than solving problems. Solving community problems, state problems, national problems, international problems. I mean, if you've been following just the Ebola situation as it's broken in the last couple of days, you know, everybody's blaming everybody else. There's really, it's become such a harsh place to have a discussion. Probably people will just back away rather than engage. So without safe public spaces, people have no means to engage. There's just too few places in our society that are set aside for this purpose. And let's face it, you can't really sit down and have a civil conversation with people we disagree with at the mall. Not only do we have too few public spaces for this kind of discourse, but we also have too few opportunities to hear from others who may disagree with us. I see here a book by University of Pennsylvania political scientist Diana Mutz called Hearing the Other Side. She has done an incredible job documenting our limited exposure in our society to diverse viewpoints. It's where we live and work. It's basically with people like us. And consequently, we rarely have the opportunity to engage in authentic dialogue about our pressing problems with people whose views differ from our own. So how do we find those safe spaces for the dialogue necessary to democratic discourse? Ray Oldenburg, you may remember in his book, Great Good Places, talks about those third places in our society, places essential to the political processes of democracy. Now, these places have to be trusted, safe, meaning safe for people to express themselves respectfully, neutral, boundary-spanning, accessible, inclusive, interactive, and respectful of all voices. It needs to be a place where divergent viewpoints are expected and welcomed. So think about, in your community, what kinds of spaces fit that bill? We not only need to find those safe spaces, but we also have to make those spaces welcoming for everyone. As conveners and moderators of these conversations, we need to make sure that we encourage everyone to participate, ensure balanced participation, and ourselves remain neutral on the content of the discussion. So that means we need to carefully set up the room and find ways to have facilitators joining us that know how to do this kind of work. And for those of you who have not participated in some of our earlier webinars, we teach you how to be a good moderator to do all this. So here's some good examples of spaces that are conducive to this type of civil public discourse. Now, they could be libraries, senior centers, schools, the David Mathews Center. You saw some pictures of dialogue going on there, a great space in Alabama. But what these spaces need to be is grounded in our communities, leveraged through partnerships, diverse and inclusive, and comfortable for everyone. So I hope you can think of some really good places where you can have this dialogue in your community. So we're going to stop here and turn over the discussion to you. We'll answer your questions and talk more about the topics of most interest for you, to you. I want to thank you for listening, and we've got our contact information here. I'll come back on to thank people, but let's see what kind of questions people have raised.
Thanks, Nancy. This is Sarah again. Thanks to all of our presenters for that great information. Like Nancy said, we have about 15 minutes for questions. So if you want to type any questions in the chat box at the lower right of your screen, we will get those directed to the right presenter. And we have one already from Donna, who says, bringing diversity meet. What's your favorite method?
So I know Carolyn likes talking about this topic. Carolyn, do you want to jump in here, or Kristen or Robert can join us as well?
Sure. Nothing beats a personal invitation. Now, I've been a librarian, so we meet all kinds of people, and that helps. But staying connected with all different kinds of organizations, getting to know people across the community, and then, calling them up and saying, I really need you to be here because you've got a point of view that needs to be heard. It makes a world of difference to do it personally.
Chris McCauley, I completely agree with Carolyn, and I think there are a variety of ways you can reach out to folks. You can call them, you can send them an email, you can work to meet with them face-to-face, but letting people know that their voice is needed and letting them know that their voice is valued, that their perspective is valued. Often by engaging in collaborative partnerships with other community organizations, it can be that can prove to be very helpful in terms of maybe reaching folks in the community that you don't often get the opportunity to work with, but need to be a part of the naming and framing exercise. So I really do truly agree with Carolyn's point of view, and I think the personal element is very important, and also establishing mutual trust and letting folks know that real reciprocity is in place.
Thanks, Chris and Carolyn. I see we have a couple more questions being typed right now. In the meantime, I have a question, and that is, what kind of time commitment and financial can you expect going into this whole process?
Well, let's see who might want to jump in on that one. I think what we're talking about here is on a long continuum. You can do this in short spurts, not doing a whole lot, or you can do it like Virginia Beach did it. And I'll let Carolyn tell you a little bit about her experience in Virginia Beach and the work they've done there, both on short efforts. Carolyn?
On redevelopment, we had the city manager's stamp of approval, which counts for a lot. And as I recall, we had $27,000 allocated from the city council, which went in a variety of directions. One of the things we did was hire a retired newspaperman to do telephone interviews of people who never get asked anything, to get even more points of view. We worked for about a year and met weekly in planning sessions, and about every third week with the public volunteers, of whom there were 100. I couldn't believe that there were 100 people in the community that were willing to give a year to this, but there were. We worked on transportation. That was considerably short. Well, what should be the future transportation in Virginia Beach? I think that was shorter. We had fewer meetings altogether. I think it depends a lot on what resources you have and what you can devote to it. And it's probably a good idea to assess those resources up front. There is, in the upcoming deliberation, going to be a little bit of talk about doing what they call framing on the fly, where the topic is so immediate that you haven't got time to spend a year on it. So it can range.
Thanks, Carolyn. We have a couple more questions waiting for us. Next one is, what would you do differently if you frame an issue?
So, do you want to jump in here?
Absolutely. I think reflecting on what needs to be done differently after every project cycle, in our case, Alabama Issues Forums, is really important to think through what worked and what could be done better. And I'd say the number one thing that I often take away from any naming and framing workshop is the need for more voices in the room. The need to make sure that you have diverse perspectives and that you have folks in the room who maybe don't necessarily agree on many different issues in the community, or they may not agree on the different approaches that emerge during the naming and framing workshop, but they have real concerns around the issue. And those are folks that we need to try to find ways of better connecting so that we can hopefully identify common ground when we start to deliberate together. So I'd say that's probably the number one thing. And Carolyn has made several points around that, as well as Nancy during her presentation. But I think you want to have as many voices in the room as possible. You face some logistical challenges with that sometimes, and as Carolyn said, sometimes you got to kind of work to name and frame an issue on the fly. But I think overall, if you have the time, if you have the resources, and you know that the issue is really needs to be addressed in the community, whatever issue it might be, I'd really say that the number one thing to focus in on is trying to make sure you have as many people in the room as possible, or people with as many different perspectives as possible, letting them know that their voices are valued.
That is probably a good segue to our next question, which is about logistics. What is the best time of day to meet, or day of the week, when you can get as many people as possible, as many diverse people as possible in that room?
We haven't heard from you. Do you want to jump in here?
Who were you asking, Nancy? You cut off a bit.
available, still there to answer that question?
Yes, I am. I wasn't sure who you was either. Well, I think that's probably going to be a very individual thing by community. Sometimes in my work it's gotten down to when the space is available, and if you have the luxury of being able to have some meetings in the evening, some meetings during the day. I think with a lot of people sometimes this work gets divvied up into different parts and committees and teams doing research or teams doing interviews. So some of that can go on as people decide for themselves when their own team can meet. Some of it can be done from wherever people live. Some of it can be done by phone. And so the work really, there's a lot of options in how to do the work, and then eventually to have some update meetings when people can get together. But I think there's a lot of flexibility in choosing be able to get together and stay up with each other and what's going on.
This is Nancy again. Carolyn and I participated in a national framing effort through the American Library Association where we looked at privacy issues. And we did most of the framing virtually. So we didn't really have to have, we had only a few meetings and they were virtual meetings. So there's, as Patty said and others have said, there's many, many ways to do this. There's on-the-fly framing, which you could do, just in a one-shot kind of meeting, or you can do it over a series of days, weeks, months. It really depends on you, your community, your resources, the depth of the issue. I see here there's a question from Patrick about local versus national, and I thought maybe this would be a good time to give an example. When I was living in State College, Pennsylvania, we did a local issue, but we based it on a national framework. So we took the issue, it was a college town, as you know, State College, where Penn State is, and drinking was a really big problem in that town. And there was already developed an issue map and framework around underage drinking and problems around it that had been done by with the National Issues Forum and the Kettering Foundation. So we actually took that framework and we had students from classes at the university for credit, which was part of their class assignment, take the framework and apply it locally. So they got to think through a national problem, but how it affected people locally, and they talked to everybody from the police, the head of the police department, to planners, to people in public health. They even talked to people in liquor stores, community people to find out better what it was that was so irritating about the behaviors of some of the students. So they really took a national issue and reframed it for local purposes. Anybody else who put up your hand if you want to jump in?
Yeah, Nancy, I think I agree with all of that. And one thing I would say is that in the National Issues Forums Institute, which has been going on since 1981, the original idea of national issues was that if something's a national issue, that means it's a public problem so widespread and in so many communities that it's national, it's nationwide. It didn't mean a federal issue. So although a framework that might be on a national issue of, say, drug abuse or, like Nancy said, abuse of alcohol in college settings or elsewhere might be sort of generic, but then people do often want to take that and make it specific to their own community situation on that national problem.
I'd like to go back for a second and just clarify that when we did the privacy framing, it was a nationwide issue, but all the members who worked on the process went back home and met with groups of people and did the what concerns you when I say the word privacy kind of research with the public before we had those virtual meetings and did the framing work. So there was, we didn't do the experts plan the wicked problem thing.
Kristen or Robert, do you want to jump in here? Give us some examples from your experience, since you have a lot of experience.
Sure, I'll jump in. It's Kristen from the Mathews Center. Talking about, I noticed the question from Patrick about local versus global or national issues. And we've done a lot of work with local communities who want to name and frame local issues, specifically issues with youth. And that's been very transformative and powerful, seeing the young people get a chance to identify issues in their community and name those as well. But a lot of those issues we find have, that you can take those local issues and also they can have an impact in other communities in the region or even across the nation. Particularly, we worked in the Montevallo community, which is where our offices are located. It's very small, and the young people in the community wanted to focus on retaining youth in the community and how do we strengthen the future of Montevallo so that young people want to stay and build roots and lives in the community. And although the issue guide was very Montevallo specific, the themes that they identified, the approaches that they framed can be applied to many, many rural communities all across the South End.
One of the things that we have found in doing this work, at least in my experience, is lots of times when there's an issue of concern in your community, I've often found if the National Issues Forum hasn't created an issue book around it, some other communities have. And if you find what they did in their communities, it can be a really nice template to start the discussion you're having in your own community. So we did one when I lived in State College on emergency planning. And we used a framework that was developed in California, but we started applying it locally, and we got all of the emergency planning people together from the community. They had all worked together before, but they'd never worked together with the community's voice. And so being at the table with the people in the community, they started to realize that there was no public voice as part of emergency planning. It was all professionals talking to professionals. And so once they started hearing from the public in these discussions, they realized that they needed to rethink the way they were interacting with the community. And lo and behold, one year on election day, I was a poll watcher at the building where the emergency people had a lot of the emergency people had their offices. And they had developed a handbook for the public, which came out of that discussion, recognizing that they had to give the public more voice and they had to bring the public in more in this very important work. So let's see, we're just about out of time. I don't think we have any more questions. So I am going to wrap up here. Thank you all for listening and joining us today, and we hope we'll see you again. Don't forget, we've got links to other resources for you and other information from the downloads. And I want to particularly thank the ALA Public Programs Office for your assistance in producing the webinar. We do a whole lot of work behind the scenes before the webinar gets going, so their work is not just from today. Our colleagues at the David Mathews Center, who've worked so diligently with us for months to plan the program, and my colleagues at the American Library Association Center for Civic Life Advisory Committee for their unwavering commitment to promoting public engagement through libraries. So thanks a lot, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you.